Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome everybody to our V group. We have been meeting for the past 6 weeks, and this V group, this virtual learning community, is a part of the Islamic Schools League of America's efforts to continue to provide networking platforms to you all, Islamic school leaders and educators, people involved in Islamic schools in some capacity or another. As you all know, the Islamic Schools League of America is a nonprofit that's been around for about 20 years. And we started off with networking through our email listserv, the IECN. And through that, which continues to be really active today, we are able to discuss all kinds of really pertinent issues. And VPeer is an organization that we partnered with just last year. And I'm going to pass the baton over to Rosina to speak a little bit about the way in which VPeer fits into ISLA's overall mission of providing a space and supporting full-time Islamic school educators.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So I'm one of the co-facilitators for this discussion group. So VPeer, its role in ISLA's mission is so important because a lot of the problems that educators face are not techno-rational. There's not one easy answer to a lot of the problems. And this particular topic is one of those problems. And so when you have complex problems, they require complex solutions. That requires a lot of people getting together with a lot of background, experience and different knowledges that they bring to the problem in order to help, if not solve it, right, but find ways to understand better, to have a clearer, conception, particularly because the discourse on same-sex attraction and gender identity in dominant spaces is different from how Muslims understand it, like so many other big problems that educators face. So thank you, Brother Waheed, for joining us today, and we look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Sister Shaza and Sister Rosina. My name is Yahya. I am the Community Development Associate for ISLA, and it's a real honor, pleasure to be here with all of you today. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We begin with the name of Allah, and I pray that Allah puts barakah in our gathering today, and that we can all benefit, inshallah, from the words of Brother Waheed. So Brother Waheed, I just want to introduce Brother Waheed here before we begin. Is a physician, a medical researcher, a blogger, and the producer of the podcast Away Beyond the Rainbow, which is a podcast series dedicated to Muslims experiencing same-sex attractions who want to live a life true to Allah and Islam, and to helping Muslim families, communities, and institutions navigate questions related to Islam and homosexuality in the contemporary world. I've had the pleasure to meet Brother Waheed on a number of occasions, and he's someone who has really helped me personally understand this issue. And I think as educators, we really can learn a lot from him, and especially as someone who experiences SSA. This is a voice, as I mentioned in the email, that's often left out of these conversations. So we've had a chance over the past 6 weeks, many of us here today, to explore this issue, to read articles, but it's also important to put a human side on this too, and to hear from someone who actually deals with this issue day in and day out, and who has courageously spoken out, shared his experience on the blog, on the podcast, and a number of other presentations. And I think we really can benefit our communities that we're involved in too by listening to him, by learning from him and his resources that he's put together. And inshallah, it will benefit our whole Muslim school community, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair, Brother Waheed, it's a real honor to have you today. This is a small group, which is great. We'll have some time for questions after your presentation. And I'll hand it over to you now for the presentation, inshallah.
All right, great. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. I am incredibly grateful and honored to be here. Thank you so much for all of your kind words and for your invitation. I'm very, very excited to be presenting today's presentation on same-sex attractions and gender identity. As Brother Yahya mentioned, I have to click on this, it seems. All right. As Brother Yahya mentioned, I'm a blogger and I host a podcast. So for the past couple of years, I've been blogging on waheedjensen.wordpress.com, where I talk about same-sex attractions and issues that we face on a day-to-day basis when we deal with same-sex attractions and gender identity issues, and we try to adhere to Islam and to the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And last year, I started this podcast, Away Beyond the Rainbow. Some of you may have listened to a couple of episodes. I would love to hear your feedback on that when we have the chance to go into the Q&A session, inshallah. I'll be referring to a lot of the episodes throughout the webinar because a lot of these concepts that I will be presenting today have been discussed thoroughly in the episodes. So in case you would like to refer back to that, you can just jot down the numbers of the episodes, inshallah. So for today's presentation, it's going to be hopefully 1 hour where I will be talking about three main themes. So the first one is going to be the origin of homosexual attractions. Mainly, is it genetic, is it environmental, nature versus nurture? We want to talk about trauma, family dynamics, and shame. And we also want to talk about the psychological perspectives. And this is going to be a huge part of today's presentation. Which I believe that families need to understand, and educators, first and foremost, like yourselves, need to be able to, first, as a starting point, understand these intricate concepts and how everything eventually correlates with the development of same-sex attractions and gender identity issues. Because if we don't talk about these things, then we're not going to be able to navigate any of that territory. So that's the first part, inshallah. The second part is going to be about history, politics, and the gay identity from a modernist, postmodernist approach versus the Islamic paradigm that we adopt. And finally, I'm going to end the presentation by talking about support systems and relevant resources that people need to know about, especially educators who deal with these issues, inshallah. So starting with origin of homosexual attractions, talking about family dynamics, shame, trauma, and psychology. All of these have been discussed in the podcast in episode 7 to 13. If you would like to, know more about these or read more resources, I've included all the details in there, inshallah. So the first thing is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it both? There's always this question of, is there a gay gene? Do genes play a role? If I'm going to give you just one sentence to wrap this up, I'm going to tell you that there have been so many studies that have been published throughout decades, and they have been critiqued. Either they've been lacking in consistency and replication, their methodology was flawed, they were inconclusive, and they were at best speculative. And if anyone is interested, whether you find any students or you yourself might be interested in actually all these genetic studies, there is one book that I recommend, which is My Genes Made Me Do It: Homosexuality and the Scientific Evidence by Neil and Briar Whitehead. The authors are biochemists, so they are scientists by profession. They have summarized 20 plus years of research, included more than 10K scientific papers and publications from all sides of the debate, and it's actually updated on a continuous basis. So this summarizes the entire thing if anyone is interested in finding out more. But I'm going to only refer to a very quick study which has been published in the reputable journal Science in August 2019. And it included 500,000 participants. And the study was funded by MIT and Harvard. And it's the largest study to date. That is a genomic study to try and see if there is a genetic influence on same-sex sexual behavior. What they found from this large sample size is that there are 5 spots on the human genome that are linked to same-sex sexual behavior, but none of them is reliable enough to predict someone's sexuality. In other words, there is no gay gene. And this is actually what the lead author himself has said. There are certain loci or spots on the human genome that may increase the chance of same-sex sexual behavior, but it's not predetermining in any way or form. It might be polygenetic, but at best, it's actually up to 25% influence. So the genes might actually influence only a quarter of sexual behavior. The rest is explained by environmental or cultural factors. Keeping this in mind, let's go into what is known by researchers nowadays, which is that same-sex attractions, gender identity, all of these things are actually a combination of biological, developmental, and environmental influences. There is also a talk about epigenetics, which I'm sure some of you may have known about this before, but epigenetics basically means that the environment plays a role whether particular genes are going to be expressed or silenced. So there are certain stimuli in the environment that might actually allow me to express a particular gene or might silence a gene that I already have, which shows you that there is an interplay between the environment and genetics. Now, in any case, what we need to understand, and this is sometimes blurred in the media and in contemporary writing, which is the difference between predisposition and predetermination or causation. In other words, correlation versus causation. When I have a certain predisposition to a particular thing, it doesn't mean that, there's a causative factor. It doesn't mean that I'm going to end up doing that particular thing or expressing that particular gene. That's not going to happen. That's not how it works. If there's a correlation between two variables, it doesn't mean that it is causation. It doesn't mean it's sealed, it's fate, it's predetermined. That's not what it means. So we need to understand that someone might be predisposed to same-sex attractions, homosexual tendencies, gender dysphoria or gender identity issues, but it doesn't mean that that's going to happen 100%, right? We can think of it as a lock and key model. We might be having a lock, which is the predisposition, but not until we find the key which actually opens the lock will we be able to express the specific phenotype that we're talking about. And in this case, we're talking about same-sex attractions or gender identity issues. And in addition to that, that's not an argument for its normality. So just because someone is predisposed to something doesn't make it normal or doesn't make the behavior itself normal. There are a lot of studies that talk to you about certain people predisposed to psychopathic behavior or criminality. Not that SSA is related to that, but it doesn't make any of these things normal or acceptable. So keeping this in mind, let's talk about how we look at the influence of genes on our temperaments and behaviors in sexual orientation and gender identity. The way that we understand it right now is that we have genes and we have prenatal hormones, which are during pregnancy. Those play a role in influencing our temperamental predisposition, meaning I have a predisposition that is based upon those biological givens, which are the genes and the hormones, that I had no influence on whatsoever. And these give me a certain predisposition, which is my temperament. And this temperament is going to either make me more likely to be gender conforming or opposite sex attracted, so OSA is opposite sex attraction, or heterosexual potential, versus gender nonconformity and possible same-sex attractions, or homosexual potential. Now, those are the interaction between biology and predisposition, or the temperament. On top of all of that, we have the social environment, which is the parents, the family, the siblings, the peers, the colleagues, my school system, right? And all of these three are going to influence my gender identity and sexual orientation. Now, what is presented nowadays is that, okay, it's either predetermined, meaning genes and prenatal hormones, they make you gay and that's it. Or, okay, well, you're gay because of your genes and your hormones, as well as your social environment, and that's it. Your fate is sealed. That is what's presented nowadays. But the Islamic paradigm, and actually the scientific paradigm, if we're going to use that, it adds a fourth variable, which is the free will and choice. And this is very important because the free will and choice allows me to choose the values that I'm going to abide by, the behaviors that I'm going to engage in, and the social groups that I'm going to be part of. Even though I might be predisposed to a specific gender identity or sexual orientation, it doesn't mean that that is beyond me. I have a choice at the end of the day, and that's part of Allah's justice, right? So keeping this in mind, I'm going to go a little bit into what is known as the exotic becomes erotic to try and understand, well, how does this temperament actually lead to or correlate with gender conformity versus gender nonconformity? A very famous theory by Daryl Bem, who is a social psychologist himself, is known as exotic becomes erotic. And I'm going to explain it very briefly. What he said is that a temperament is going to make certain individuals enjoy particular activities in childhood. And this makes those activities, so basically, in other words, those activities might actually be same gender or cross-gender activities. So an individual who belongs to a particular gender might enjoy activities that are shared by individuals of his or her same gender, or they might enjoy activities that are enjoyed by individuals of the opposite gender. So this is same versus cross-gender activities. Now, I might be a gender-conforming child if I am a male who enjoys the activities, the appearances, the behaviors of other males. And I might be a gender non-conforming male if I enjoy the activities, the behaviors, the dressing, the movements, the affectations of females, and vice versa for females when it comes to males. Now, what happens is that gender-conforming children are going to feel similar and close to individuals of their same gender, but they feel different from members of the opposite gender. But here, the idea here is that gender non-conforming children feel closer to individuals of the opposite gender because they identify more with them. But they feel a sense of physiological arousal. It doesn't necessarily mean sexual. It just means that I feel that I'm different from those people. Normally, you would expect boys to be feeling different from girls and girls to be feeling different from boys. But with gender nonconformity, it's actually the opposite. Because boys have always identified with girls, they feel that they're very similar to girls, but they feel a sense of arousal with boys, and vice versa when it comes to girls. And this eventually leads to sexual arousal once puberty hits. In other words, exotic, which is something that I'm not familiar with, that is different from me, becomes erotic. And that's the gist of his theory. Now, if you want to look at studies, he actually went into a lot of studies and he made a meta-analysis of 48 clinical studies, which found that gender nonconformity is actually the strongest predictor of a homosexual orientation. Again, it's a predictor, it's a correlation, not a causation, but it is there, it's significant. When we look at one study from the Kinsey Institute, they actually saw that 1,000 individuals who identify as gay as lesbian versus 500 individuals who acted as a control, meaning heterosexual, quote unquote, he found that there's a 63% gender non-conforming behavior in the individuals belonging to the gay and lesbian group versus only 10 to 15% of gender non-conformity in the control group. And when he looked at longitudinal studies on individuals who are gender non-conforming, particularly boys, he followed them up from the age of 7 until they became adults. We see again the same percentage. 63% of those boys identified as gay or bisexual when they became adults. So this is in general how a particular temperament or interest in specific activities and behaviors will influence a person's gender nonconformity and sexual orientation. Now, before we go into the family dynamics, I just want to talk a little bit about trauma. And as educators, you know this better than me, which is trauma is any event that is distressful. This is a very general definition of trauma. Any event that is very distressful to the mind, that is either received or perceived as such by the mind. And this is a very important distinction because sometimes we might be perceiving something as traumatic when it's objectively not traumatic to other people. And that explains the difference in resilience between different people. So we can all agree that, if we want to give definitions of traumas or examples of traumas, we can all give examples of, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, parental separation, domestic violence, wars, explosions, violence, imprisonment, death, and so on. So these are overt kinds of traumas, and no one is going to disagree on that. But there is another kind of, underestimated or often overlooked trauma, which is the subtle kind of trauma that is not often talked about. And educators like yourself kind of, need to be aware of these things because they influence how we engage in this discussion. Examples of these are harsh criticism by parents, for example, an emotional absence of one or both of the parents, neglect, or if one or both of the parents are actually perfectionists to a punitive extent, or any other parental pressures, these are traumatic to the child because the brain perceives them as distressful. The same thing happens when a child is not given love, affection, attention, care, and protection. That is not healthy for the mind, and the brain goes into survival mode. And time again, when you try and find research correlating trauma with mental health issues, you will find the same conclusion over and over again. There is an increased likelihood of mental health disorders associated with childhood traumas. Post-traumatic stress, obsessive-compulsive disorders, generalized anxiety, panic, mood disorders, self-harm, and even suicide have been linked to childhood traumatic experiences. And we're not talking just about overt trauma, which is traumatizing, but also the subtle trauma has the same effects. Now, keeping this in mind, let's go into the family dynamics that I want to talk about. And I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible, but there's a lot to talk about. So in case anything is not very clear, I'd be happy to clarify it, inshallah, in the Q&A session afterwards. So if we're going to assume that this is the era of the first 3 years of age of a child's life, in the first year and a half or the first 18 months, psychologists always say that the child is always connected to the mother, right? Whether that's a girl or a boy, the child perceives him or herself as one entity with the mother. From 18 months or a year and a half until 3 years of age, there is a separation individuation phase, which means that the child is going to perceive him or herself as an autonomous self, as a separate entity. So the girl is going to separate from her mother. She realizes that her mother is her mother, but I am me, I am autonomous. And the same thing happens with the boy. He sees himself as separate from the mom. But, and this is very important here, there is something extra that we need to understand, which is the boy has to separate from the mom, and he has to move forward and be accepted by the dad. So he has 2 steps. He needs to separate and he needs to be accepted by the father, to separate from the feminine and to be accepted by the masculine. And this explains why boys or men in general have a higher chance of having gender identity issues, and there is a higher rate of having male homosexuality compared to female homosexuality. Because of the added step that happens here, there is a higher chance of problems happening, and I will be explaining this further. And it's not a coincidence that the gender identity phase actually happens in this period, right, up until 3 years of age. And that's why you'll find a lot of people who say that I experience same-sex attractions or gender identity. I've always felt that ever since I was born. Well, because the brain develops during this period and they've internalized all of that without them realizing it. So the moment that they are aware of things happening and they form their memory, they've always identified as such because it happens during these critical periods. Let us elaborate further. Let's take a family which includes a male child, and we are assuming that this male is going to become same-sex attracted, or he has the potential to develop same-sex attractions. Normally, in a normal father, mother, son relationship, the mother is going to allow the child to separate from her, not to be excluded, obviously, but to allow this child to be an autonomous self, to have that freedom. And the father is going to be embracing of that child. And in psychology, in psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theory, the father is termed as salient. For him to have the quality of salience, he has to fulfill 2 things. He has to be strong enough as a masculine role model, and he also has to be benevolent or warm and loving. He has to fulfill both of these in order to be salient. And also, of course, the dynamic between the father and the mother has to be stable enough to provide the child with a nurturing environment to grow. Now, when we talk about this child who has a potential of developing same-sex attractions, we're already talking about a baseline of hypersensitivity. So he has this temperamental predisposition that we talked about, which is being sensitive. Now, being sensitive has a negative connotation in today's world, but it is actually a gift and a curse, if you want, or a double-edged sword. It is a beautiful thing because it allows this individual to be an empath, to exhibit more compassion, and to be loving towards others. And those children have artistic and aesthetic abilities. But as you can imagine, it makes them more vulnerable to emotional injury. They would internalize things in ways that other boys would easily brush off as whatever, you know? So having that baseline of being temperamentally sensitive, what could go wrong in this family dynamic? The mother might actually be more overbearing. So she would be intensely affectionate, domineering, possessive, too much, such that she would not allow the boy to completely separate, individuate, and go into the masculine. Another thing that would happen is that the father simply is not salient, meaning he's strong, he's harsh, he's criticizing, so he appears as a strong masculine entity, but he's not benevolent, he's not loving and warm, he's very harsh and critical. Or he might actually be loving and warm and empathetic and benevolent, but he's weak, he's not strong, he's not attractive as a male role model for this child. He might actually be dominated by his wife. So the child sees him as a weak role model. I will not want to identify with him as a masculine, you know, to achieve that masculinity from him, I would not want to go forward into that relationship. And between the father and the mother, there might be a lot of turbulence happening. You know, the mother might be too overbearing, too draining to the father. He might be perceiving her as such. He would be distant. He might not want to interact with his wife and his child as such. And so the mother and the son would be very close to each other. If there are any older siblings, there might be a lot of issues with this younger child who is temperamentally sensitive. The father and the older sibling might be either fighting all the time or getting along all the time. Case studies have shown that usually if there's an older sibling, he would be more athletic, more, you know, getting better grades at school. He might be getting along with his father more, going on trips with his father, bonding with his father, whereas this younger child is closer to his mother. He's not as good, quote unquote, as his older sibling. So that is as far as the male child is concerned. If we look at the female child, as we said, the female needs to be separate from the mother, but she always identifies with the mother as her role model for femininity. She doesn't have that added step compared to the boy of actually separating and then going towards the father. She would stay with the mother. But again, she's sensitive, so there's a temperamental predisposition. Normally, the father and the mother in such a dynamic have to have a sort of a balance where the mother is, okay, she's the feminine role model, the father recognizes her as such, but he would always be there for his daughter for support purposes, and, you know, to bless that mother-daughter relationship. The mother has to take care of that child and to be her feminine role model, to give her a sense of being, a sense of belonging, and the father has to attune to his daughter's needs and to, again, bless that feminine relationship that's going on. With female same-sex attractions, the problem most of the time that they report is either the mother is too connected, incredibly domineering to the point that the relationship is described as enmeshment, that the daughter says, I couldn't identify who is who. It's like we were one entity. My needs are her needs are my needs. It's a codependent relationship. Or the mother was extremely distant, completely neglectful, not there at all whatsoever. Even though physically she might be there, but emotionally she was disconnected. The father, on the other hand, may not have had the capabilities to attune to his girl's needs. He might not have been there, he might not have provided emotional support, so she always felt lacking. So that's as far as the female and the male child is concerned. If you want to talk about further, so taking that as a baseline, we see a temperamental sensitivity, we see some, you know, turbulent dynamics between the father and the child, the mother and the child, the father and the mother. What is going to happen as we go along? Between 5 and 12 years of age, so this is pre-puberty, prepubescent, this is called the latency period, where the child grows up and he starts interacting with his or her peers, goes to kindergarten, school, and there's a chance to interact with other people and starts developing his interests, temperaments, and likings. What's going to happen is, as we said, there is the child, and here we're talking about a male child. The child tried to connect continuously with the father. He failed. Either the father was too harsh all the time, that the child was always afraid, or the boy tried to connect time and time again, but the father wasn't reciprocating. And the mother is there, and he is emotionally attached to the mother. Failed attempts to connect with a father over years and years and years will lead to something that is known as defensive detachment. And this is very important to know, because this is a self-protection mechanism that's done by the brain. And as it is, from the name itself, it's a detachment and it's defensive. The child does it without even recognizing. It means that I'm going to detach from my father. And it's not just my father. I'm going to detach from you. I reject you and what you represent. I reject you and your masculinity because you have rejected me. I want to preserve myself from harm. This is what the brain interprets it. I need to preserve myself from harm. I'm going to reject that source of pain. And that doesn't just apply to the father, it applies by default to all his peer relations with other boys. So he feels intimidated by other boys, he rejects other boys, and he finds company with girls. So he's emotionally isolated from males and masculinity, and he's closer to femininity. He finds femininity and females to be more familiar. And a very common metaphor that's used is a kitchen window boy. So the boy isn't helping his mother at the kitchen, but he looks outside the window and he sees the neighborhood boys playing together. They're engaging in the rough and tumble play. And he wants to be part of that. He feels jealous because he wants to be there, but he also feels afraid because he's afraid of rejection. He's afraid of shame. And he just doesn't know how to deal with that because it's unfamiliar territory. And so there's gender nonconforming behavior. He, again, chooses and prefers the company of females, and therefore their behaviors, their interests, their activities. Now, when puberty hits, usually around the age of 13, this is called the erotic transitional phase. Before that, the boy may have had a crush, let's say, on a male peer of his at school. It was very sentimental, very innocent, everything was fine. When puberty hits, it becomes eroticized, because then it becomes sexual. And again, exotic becomes erotic. What I don't know, what is distant from me as boys, they become eroticized. And another term other than defensive detachment that is necessary to know is something known as a reparative drive. There is a drive inside of me to repair that deficit that I've always longed for, and it becomes eroticized, unfortunately. So the definition of that, it's an attempt to repair a deficit in masculine identity and the affective needs through homoerotic behavior. And affective needs meaning the needs that he never had from his father or his male role model, meaning attention, affection, approval, and love. That unfortunately becomes homoerotic behavior. So you will find a lot of these boys, almost all of them, would start engaging in homoerotic fantasies, masturbation, pornography, and even hooking up, as it's becoming right now very popular in our culture. This starts happening. It's not genuinely, it's not about sex. It's actually about trying to relate to another man. But because things are very messed up in one's brain, such that those affective needs have been intertwined with the sexual needs, that's the only way that the boy knows how to relate to someone else. So that's the reparative drive. For the girl, it's exactly the same, but in a different twist. So as we said, there's also a defensive detachment, but from the mother. In this case, either she's afraid of being engulfed completely by the mother because she's codependent, or she's met with nothingness from the mother. She detaches from femininity. And so she might be actually hostile or antagonistic towards her mother, or she might be latent or helpless, especially if the mother is someone who is helpless herself. She might be sick, she might need taking care of. And so the girl might not have it in her to be hostile or antagonistic towards her. So she just adopts this behavior of being, you know, helpless. And she would be like, okay, I need to take care of her, but at the same time, I don't feel her. So she's detached from her. And again, there's gender nonconformity because she prefers the company of men. She feels that maybe they understand me more. I identify more with them. Or she feels that she's not even related to females. She feels detached from them. So she's not one of the girls anyway. Now, there is something very important to know here. If a girl finds at least some of the traits in womanhood, femininity, to be desirable, then that would give her a sense of stability, meaning she would still identify as a female, versus someone else who completely rejects femininity and she's a biological female. That would lead to gender identity disorder and later transsexualism, because she has rejected everything that's related to femininity and adopted the masculine mannerisms and perceives herself to be a male as opposed to a biological female. And again, in this case, the woman is emotionally isolated from other girls and women. She feels excluded, even though she might have friends who are females, but she doesn't feel completely adequate as a female. And she feels that she's on the outside looking in. And women, particularly in young age groups, when she's still young, let's say entering school for the first time, she would have a very strong emotional relationship with the principal or, you know, a school teacher or one of her peers who are older than her, because she's trying to find that mother that she never had, or at least adequately never found. And when we talk about family dysfunction, we also need to talk about shame. And shame in general, if I want to define it, it's the feeling that I am not good enough. And this is very important to understand when we talk about individuals who have same-sex attractions and gender identity issues. I would tell you personally, from the people that I've interacted with, starting with myself and others, whether men or women who deal with these issues, and the books that I've read and the resources that I've been exposed to, shame is the common denominator. I am not good enough, and it starts from childhood. How do these family dynamics lead to shame? For a lot of these families, unfortunately, for parents to show love and warmth and affection, it was conditional, as opposed to being unconditional. If you do this and this and that, I will give you love. If you're not good at school, if you do not obey me, then there will be consequences. The difference is my love is conditional. Of course, there is a way of disciplining children, but love should always be there. It should be unconditional. In such families, it was conditional. Expressions of love, be they verbal or physical, they were either infrequent or even lacking altogether. Some of these boys and girls were never told, I love you, like to that extreme extent. Boys were shamed for being weak and unmasculine. Girls were shamed for being too needy, too sensitive, not too pretty. And unfortunately, those messages become internalized. Remember, we're talking about children who are sensitive from the get-go. So they will take these messages and they will become part of their narratives, their internal chatter 24/7. Whenever they fail to meet parental expectations, they will blame it on themselves. They are chronically dissatisfied with themselves, and this takes place over years and years and years. And what happens is this: I am not good enough. I will never be good enough. No matter what I do, I'm always going to be inferior and inadequate. The pain, the anger, the hurt that results out of that, the pain and the frustration that I'm not able to connect with my parent, that my parent is not seeing me, they're not loving me, they're not giving me the attention and the love that I need, will be like, okay, what do they want from me? How can I get their love if I do what they want from me? So, okay, I'm going to put on this mask of being a good little boy, good little girl. I'm going to start pleasing my parents. It's a false self. I mean, it's not genuine, but I need to do this in order to survive. This is what the brain interprets it. So they end up neglecting their own needs. They end up pleasing their parents just to get the love that they should have always been given. And that ends up internalizing more pain, anger, and hurt. Many of them split into this mindset of seeing everything as all black or white, all good or bad. no gray areas. And splitting, as some of you know, is part of borderline personality disorder, which can be diagnosed later on. In family dynamics where there is a power imbalance between parents, you will find this child gearing more towards the weaker parent. They're usually the helper or the savior of that parent. They take on responsibilities beyond their own age in order to help that parent. They internalize a lot of the emotional pain and the turmoil that's going on because they're sensitive. And sometimes actually they might be used as an emotional crutch by the weaker parent to get leverage from the stronger parent. And as we said, sometimes the relationships between the parent and the child might be very enmeshed. No boundaries, no autonomy. And this gives rise to codependent relationships in adulthood, where the person sees himself as, okay, if I'm going to survive this relationship, I need to give everything to the other person. There's not going to be boundaries because I've never learned to set boundaries anyway as a child. And there's something known as also anticipatory shame. It's not just shame, which is I'm not good enough, I'm never going to be good enough, I'm not lovable, etc. It's also the anticipation of shame, that my life is a series of shameful moments. There's going to be a moment in a couple of hours or a couple of days where I'm going to be shamed again. So my brain goes into survival mode, and it's just that mode that I'm used to 24/7. And one thing that Muslims need to understand, especially educators, is the concept of God and religion wounds. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of you have already experienced this, which is how God has been presented to us, unfortunately, as, you know, we've been harboring all of these negative images about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one thing that psychologists always say is that our first interaction with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes from our parents. If our parents are loving and kind, it's more likely that children will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as loving and kind. If children are harsh, critical, shaming, children are going to see God as such. And when parents use Allah as leverage in terms of, if you don't obey me, Allah will send you to hell. If you're not good, if you don't get good grades, if you're not going to do this and this and that, Allah is going to be angry at you. He's going to do this to you. So this further adds fuel to the fire, and it compounds the shame and the detachment from Allah. It's not just the detachment from a parental figure, now it becomes a detachment from Allah. Again, as we said, there's a survival mode. And so the brain is hypervigilant. When we interact with people, when we're put in an environment with others, we try to attune to the surroundings and we adjust behavior to please others. Just like I've always adjusted my behavior to please my parents, I have to do that with my peers at school, with my colleagues, with my friends. I need them to be happy with me. And this, as you can imagine, leads to so low self-esteem. It comes from a low self-esteem and it leads to further low self-esteem. And there's a constant need for assurance. And so when people say that, you know, a lot of these individuals have narcissistic personality disorder, well, it comes from a place of insecurity because they need to be reassured all the time. And when they put on these flashy clothes or they want to, you know, they adopt these behaviors just to attract your attention, it's because they want you to give them assurance that they exist, that they are loved. And it comes from a place of insecurity. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I'm gonna, hopefully I'll be able to finish this section quickly because I want to give time for the Q&A session. But that's as far as the family is concerned. When we talk about the peer relations, there's something known as an inferiority complex. So throughout these slides that I've presented so far, we've said that the child grows up with the sense of inadequacy in, you know, at home. And then he's going to end up in elementary, middle school, and these things get consolidated. And once they hit adolescence and they're in high school, they feel that they're inferior. They're not belonging. They're lonely. I'm not good enough. I'm not as good as my male peers or my female peers. Again, we're judging here from the same sex peers, right? There's a lot of self-pity and self-dramatization. Very common to hear them referring to themselves as the tragic center of the world. I'm unlovable, no one loves me, no one cares about me, everyone is out to get me, right? It's a very egocentric outlook on life. It's very childish because a lot of us have been stuck in that phase and we're not able to grow out of that. when we talk about athletics, this is a very common example. You know, males with SSA prefer to not play sports, right? Either they completely detach from that because they're afraid of it, they're afraid of judgment, or they don't know how to deal with that, or they feel, you know, inadequate. And some of them, you might find men with SSA who engage in athletics and they're really good at that, but they still feel inadequate because they don't see themselves as equal to their male peers. And as a result, there's a lot of perfectionism. You know, in order to compensate for the low self-worth that I feel, I'm going to try to overcompensate in other areas. And it becomes toxic perfectionism, actually. So one antidote to this inferiority is to try as much as possible from an early age to make up for this loss through family interventions and friends. And this is important for educators to know, because one question is, okay, how will we be able to help those students? Well, they need affectionate and strengthening relations with individuals of their same sex. It's not about sex, again, it's about getting those affective needs. For the man to feel that he is a man among men, and for the woman to feel that she is a woman among women. That they are accepted, that they are good enough, that we're not going to judge you, we're just going to love you for who you are as a person, as a servant of Allah, as our friend, as our colleague, as our son, what have you. And yeah, and the idea of about group activities that actually strengthen gender identity and belongingness, these are very important, whether they're sport activities or therapy, group therapy, or just going out and having fun, whatever that is, just to feel that I'm bonding with men, or a woman is bonding with women. Body image wounds, a lot of people, you know, struggle with that. So they might have been late bloomers, they may have matured early, they might have had physical disabilities, have been too short, too tall, too thin, too fat, whatever. Reactions from parents or peers may have been negative towards them. And so this kind of added to their low sense of self-worth and the idea that I'm inadequate, I'm insecure about my appearance, I'm going to be judged, I'm going to be shamed, I'm not good enough. Again, the whole shame narrative, it just pops up. And it's all about social criticism and rejection, whether it's received or perceived. Sometimes it's not there, but maybe somehow I internalize people's looks or their behavior towards me, which might not have been related to any of that, but this is how I found it or how I internalized it. And this adds more to the detachment from their own gender, from their own body. They reject masculinity or femininity in case of females further. So it adds more fuel to the fire. And on top of all of that, society and pop culture does play a role in this entire conversation, because nowadays we see that, you know, we're bombarded on a daily basis with gay affirmative media, whether it's on the news, TV shows, movies, music, books, billboards, wherever you look, we've been desensitized to sex and sexuality on a daily basis, heavy visual bombardment. Teens are nowadays encouraged to question and test out their sexuality, just be who you are. You know, the gay life is very glamorous. And nowadays there's further blurring of the gender lines. It's becoming more and more confusing. You know, there are not just two genders, there are so many others, and you can be whatever you want, and it's a spectrum, and so on. There are lots of LGBT clubs in schools and pro-gay counseling programs. And the coming out experience is painted as this euphoric experience where you're going to be, you know, finally able to experience your authentic self and to be who you are and to be true to who you are and all of that. And there's a community on the other side, which is providing you with the attention and the approval that you've always needed. Again, now understanding the family dynamic and where the entire background experience, it makes sense that these people are going to choose a community that finally gives them the things that they've always needed, which is the attention and the love and the care that they haven't had, right? And it's only exacerbated by easy access to gay pornography and hookup apps nowadays, unfortunately. If you look at the global trends, and this is very alarming, so if you look at just some studies, almost half of the younger generations nowadays identifies exclusively heterosexual, so the other half is identifying as not, compared to 65% of the older generations, I mean millennials. there's an acceptance report in 2007 that was published by GLAAD, which also shows you the same trends. 20% of millennials are identifying as LGBT versus 7% of the boomer generation. And you can guess that Generation Z is a higher percentage than millennials. Transgender and gender non-conforming has increased also across the years. Individuals are identifying more as gender non-conforming. Sweden, which is a pro-LGBT country, has seen a 1,500% rise in a 10-year period in gender dysphoria diagnoses among girls, teenage girls particularly. And in the UK, we see the same thing, actually. Individuals who are sent for gender treatment clinics, in a 10-year period between 2009 and 2018, there has been a 4,000% increase in those young people's referrals. So this is very alarming. And the last thing that I want to talk about, just to paint the entire picture, is childhood sexual abuse, which is very important here. Now, a lot of people tell you that, well, I haven't been sexually abused as a child, yet I have same-sex attractions or gender identity, or vice versa. I have been abused, but I'm straight, right? Or I'm cis. That's fine, because again, it's not just one variable, it's a combination of so many other variables. If we look at epidemiological studies, there is a higher correlation between childhood sexual abuse and same-sex sexuality. Among individuals who identify as lesbian or gay, there is almost a 4 times higher prevalence of physical and sexual abuse in childhood compared to individuals who identify as heterosexuals. If we're looking at women, regardless of their sexual orientation, if they're in same-sex relationships, they are 3 to 5 times more likely to have had a childhood sexual abuse experience. And with men, it's much higher. With men, it's 8 to even 13 times more likelihood of having that history. Now, how do we explain the fact that childhood sexual abuse will end up with a person identifying as gay or lesbian or having same-sex attractions? A lot of epidemiologists have actually posited some theories about this, but you know, when people are encouraged to come out and test out their same-sex sexuality at an early age, they are more prone to be taken in by predators, for example, especially if they exhibit gender non-conforming behaviors from an early age. This makes them this puts them at a higher risk of childhood maltreatment. A lot of people might have experienced this abuse event, which entails a lot of shame and pain and trauma and stigma as well. And so they chose to be associated with a minority sexual orientation that is also stigmatized in society. Another theory is that men perpetrators, which are the majority of perpetrators in childhood sexual abuse, they might have groomed the boy from an early age and led him to believe that he's gay because he enjoyed the experience. Or girls, because they were traumatized and abused sexually by men, this would have led to an aversion to men or to having sex with men. And so she found the company of women to be more protective, for example. And again, as we said, there's a defensive detachment as a baseline for this child. This detachment increases the susceptibility to a male perpetrator because it starts as an emotional relationship, and this is important to realize. It never starts with sex. It starts with giving that child the emotional love, affection, and attention that he needs or she needs, and then it turns sexual. And that sends the child into a shame, tornado, because it's like, what is happening to me? I enjoyed it, but I shouldn't have, but he loves me, but he did something wrong to me, and so it becomes chaotic. Yeah, so quickly, those are the things that I've spoken about, and I know it's too much actually that I've presented so far, but I felt that it's very important to put them all together. So we talked about temperamental predisposition, the family dynamics in terms of the homo-emotional wounds. This is what is referred to between the same-sex parent, hetero-emotional wound from the opposite sex parent. If there are sibling wounds, defensive detachment, and reparative drive is what fuels the process. Poor peer relations and the inferiority complex. Body image wounds, society and the media and the culture had effects on that. Childhood sexual abuse. And then there are some other factors here and there. which is like stress that is experienced during pregnancy or after pregnancy, if there is more detachment between the mother and the child, if there is a death of a parent that the child blames himself or herself for, if there is divorce or adoption, if a person is in a foster care system, he or she is abused or doesn't bond with the same sex, foster parent, that might lead to those issues. What's important to realize is it's not just one factor, it's a constellation of these factors, and the sum is greater than the parts, meaning that the more variables, the more boxes that one ticks, the higher the chance of the individual developing same-sex attractions or gender identity issues. To wrap up, I would suggest these books for further reading. These are very important for anyone who wants to understand more about the genesis of same-sex attractions. So Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, he's a clinical psychologist. He wrote Shame and Attachment Loss. I discussed most of his book in episodes 7, 8, 9, and 11 of the podcast. For female same-sex attraction in particular, Janelle Hallman has written this wonderful book, The Heart of Female Same-Sex Attraction, and it's summarized in episode 10 of the podcast. And in episode 12, I've personally had the privilege of interviewing Richard Cohen, who's an amazing person. He himself struggled with same-sex attractions, and then he became a therapist. He did his own healing work, and he's been helping a lot of men deal with that for decades. He wrote this book, Coming Out Straight, which is a must read for anyone who struggles with same-sex attractions and their mentors and family members. And on dealing with shame, I'm pretty sure some of you might know her already, but this woman is amazing, and I always refer to her research. If you want to understand shame more and vulnerability, I would encourage you to listen to the TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability by Brene Brown. And then if you want to learn more about this as parents, educators, anyone who's interested in learning about what shame is and how to navigate that territory and heal from it, I would recommend to start with The Gifts of Imperfection and to move to Daring Greatly and then Rising Strong. These are 3 of her books in sequence, and they are excellent to deal with shame and heal from its effects as a community, inshallah. And I've discussed some of her works in podcast episodes 2 and 3. But I would like, if there's a take-home message from everything that I've discussed this far, is that it's not about sex. What I would really like you to understand, if there's something that you want to take from this, is that it's not that. One quote by Dr. Joseph Nicolosi that I've mentioned is, homosexuality is an alienation from males. And this is with regards to males. In infancy from the father, in later life from males. By eroticizing what he feels disenfranchised from, the homosexual man is still seeking this initiation into manhood through other males. It's more about, I need to be initiated into the world of men. I've never had that chance. And that becomes sexualized, and that's the problem. So if we're going to look at a state of equilibrium and stability, which other men have, versus a man or a woman who experiences same-sex attraction, there's this deficit, right? Now, this is the reparative drive. I'm trying to repair that deficit, but unfortunately, it's through eroticization and sexually acting out. And this adds more shame, which leads to more acting out, and it leads to further shame, and it becomes a vicious cycle. But the way to help those individuals is not to engage in these things and for them to realize that there is another way out, which is trauma therapy if they've had any traumatic experiences, cognitive behavioral therapy, counseling, support systems, having platonic friendships with individuals of the same sex, and doing healing and recovery work. So that's the first part of the presentation. I know we're at the 1 hour limit. Brother Yahya, is it okay if I continue for 10 more minutes? Or should we start with the Q&A part?
Yeah, I think that's okay. That would be great. I think everyone is probably okay for 10 more minutes before the question answer. Yeah, please.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So the second part that I'm going to be talking about is a little bit about history, politics, and the gay identity. And this has mostly been discussed in episode number 5 of the podcast. So to understand all of that, we need to talk about the sexual revolution, which started last century. And, its basic tenet is a rejection of the Abrahamic religious moral norms, particularly from a Christian perspective, but it applies to, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic, paradigms, which is anything that leads to gender, sex, and sexuality that's been controlled in religion we call for a revolution against all of that. So there's a separation between sex, reproduction, and marriage that's, the aftermath that we're dealing with here. Sex, reproduction, and marriage have always been together. Let's say, at least in our Islamic understanding, sex leads to reproduction under a marriage framework. But that's not the case because of the sexual revolution and the freedom that's propagating as a result of that. And then there's also a separation of biological sex, gender identity or expression, and sexual orientation, when normally we would expect, in the majority of cases, for all of these to be aligned. That's been separated. Whereas there is a fusion or an amalgamation of desires, actions, and identity. In our Islamic framework, we see them as separate, actually, which is your desires are separate from your actions, and your actions are separate from your identity. The three are different. Whereas nowadays, we see these as equal. If you have these desires, you're going to act out based upon these desires. And if you act based on your desires, then that's your identity, which doesn't make sense from an Islamic perspective. And more, we also see a demise of the nuclear family. We have more fatherless families, more delinquent behavior such as promiscuity, which is promoted. And it puts all of us as religious believers in a very difficult position to kind of navigate this territory. On the other hand, when we look at the Islamic perspective, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always talks in the Quran about the creation of the male and the female, and that the male is different from the female, and there's beauty to both of them. And this dichotomy is very important. There's a biological complementarity between the male and the female versus in same-sex relationships, which is never there, right? There is a complementarity in our disposition in terms of the masculine traits and the feminine traits. The fathers are different from the mothers. Both of them are significant. And as we've seen, earlier in this presentation, both of them play an important role in developing a healthy child. So, and these are different. And in addition to that, the religious rules for men are different from those for women. When it comes to almost everything in Islam, even an example, the prayers, when we make sujood, the way that a woman makes sujood is different from the way that a man makes sujood. And so, in addition to all of that, even in our fitra, in our disposition, there are differences. And these come from the divine attributes of Jalal and Jamal, majesty and beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So men have more of the Jalal, majestic attributes, and women have more of the Jamal, or the beauty attributes. And that's how Allah created things, because that's the harmonious, divine creation of the universe. And even the Islamic norms, when we look at what's right, what's wrong, what's halal, what's haram, from a sexual perspective, there is a prohibition of anything that is outside, a sexual relation outside of marriage between a man and a woman. So there's prohibition of zina, of sodomy, and even anything that leads to that has to be minimized through modest clothing, through avoiding khalwa with the opposite sex, through physical contact not being okay. And even when it comes to gender, Islam recognizes that there are only two genders, male and female. Now, if we're talking about intersex individuals who have a biological abnormality, that's a completely different case, and that's already a tiny minority. But the entire Islamic paradigm operates on this perspective of male and female. In addition to the sexual revolution, the gay liberation movement started in the 1969, as you know, based on the protests at the Stonewall Club in New York City, and it took off from there. And they've always called for two things: tolerance and approval. To be tolerant means to give them the right to have political, economic, and social equality. And to be approving of them means that homosexuality is normal. Unfortunately, both of them, both tolerance and approval, have been presented as synonymous, but they're not. I mean, if you're tolerant of someone, doesn't mean that you accept their behavior as okay, but this is what it's presented as. And any disadvantage has been blamed to social and cultural prejudices, as opposed to an inherent deficit. And homophobia actually has been painted as any belief system that heterosexuality is in any way superior to or more natural than homosexuality. I mean, using this definition, all the Abrahamic religions would be by default homophobic, right? And the results of this have touched so many professions, including psychologists who have been delicensed whenever they advocate for any kind of therapy to help individuals who struggle with gender identity issues or same-sex attractions. There has been a push for gay affirmative therapy. And as you educators know better than me, there's a push on gay-friendly curricula, and any religious discourse or counseling against the current paradigms is outlawed. You already know that the American Psychological Association has been affected by this because the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, if we look back in the 50s when it first started, when it was first published, homosexuality was considered among the sociopathic personality disorders. When the DSM was revised in 1968, it was removed from that category, and it was only considered to be a deviation if it is against someone's own value system, if it is incompatible with their own sense of self. If it's okay, if it's compatible, then that's fine. And then the second revision in 1973, until this moment, there is no reference to homosexuality anymore whatsoever. Further research into homosexuality has been discouraged, except for the idea of finding a gay gene. And then it has become unfashionable to inquire into the psychological causes anymore. And if you do, then you're homophobic, and that's not acceptable. There's a lot of popular misinformation that's being circulated nowadays, and probably a lot of you already know this, which is sexual orientation is biologically determined, once gay, always gay. As we've seen in this presentation, it's not biologically determined, and there's a lot of proof that sexuality is fluid. It's not a box that you box yourself in, and it's immutable. That is not correct. Another thing is that every other culture and society throughout history has accepted homosexuality. We are the only homophobic society. That's not true. No society has accepted homosexual behavior as equal to heterosexual behavior, quote unquote. Same-sex behaviors have always existed, but they were never okay. They were seen as something that is done in private, or an anomaly or a deviation. And we're talking here about behavior and not attractions. Another argument is animals too are homosexual. Why are we the only ones judging? Well, because we don't take our moral values from animals, and B, because animals, if you go into the animal research, homosexuality in the animal kingdom is only seen in periods of stress, captivity, pollution, and when there is an abnormality in their environment. It's not the actual normal thing. And finally, the most important one is that homosexually oriented people are identical to heterosexuals in every way, psychologically and emotionally, except for the sexual preference. But as a group, they are as healthy as heterosexuals, meaning we're equal and there's nothing wrong except that we prefer someone of the same sex. But that is not okay, and that is not true even. If we look at data on the mental and the physical health, I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Gay youths account for 30% of completed suicides, and that's an 1989 report. 40% of those who identify as LGBT have attempted or seriously contemplated suicides. Gay men are 6 times more likely to attempt suicide. Lesbians are twice as likely to attempt suicide. Nearly 60% of bisexual and gay male youths used substances. Another one, LGBT youths are 9 times more likely to use injectable drugs, to engage in sexual activity, use cocaine, smoke marijuana, and tobacco before the age of 13. Now, a counter-argument to this, which you would hear often, is it's all because of social prejudice. If society was more accepting, then we wouldn't have these issues. Well, let's take a look at some of these studies that have been published. This is from Minnesota in the US in 2008, and they tried to see what is the effect of discrimination on the mental health and the services that were used by LGBT individuals. I just pasted this entire thing here, but you can see that poorer mental health, more substance abuse, more likely to report unmet mental health care needs among these individuals, and they were more likely to report having experienced a major incident of discrimination. Now, later in the paper, they statistically adjusted for discrimination, and they found that it did not significantly reduce the mental health disparities, meaning that if you take the variable of discrimination outside the equation, it doesn't make a difference. The results are always going to be the same. If you look at Sweden even, which is a pro-LGBT country, it's a champion for LGBT rights, and this is a very recent study in 2018. They studied the same thing, And again, same results: high risk alcohol use, cannabis use, daily tobacco smoking, psychological distress, more likely among gay men and bisexual women. And then towards the end, the same result. If you adjust statistically for social prejudice, it only partially explains the disparity, but not completely, meaning that social prejudice does have an effect, but it's a minor effect and it's not the major effect. And when we talk about identity, and this is very important, nowadays it's being pushed. I am gay, I am lesbian, who are you to reject me as a human being? We need to deconstruct that into what is essentialist versus what is constructionist. An essentializing paradigm, meaning it's essential to me, it's part of me. I am gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual, whatever. I am that. Versus the constructionist, meaning it's a construct, meaning it's not me, it's not my identity, it's something that I have, that I experience, that I deal with. So I struggle with, I experience same-sex attractions or gender dysphoria or what have you. So there is a huge difference between the two, right? One of them equates desires with actions, with identity, as we've seen, part of the aftermath of the sexual revolution, versus the constructionist, which says that my desires are different from my actions, which is different from my identity. And this is more in line with our Islamic paradigm, which means that you may have certain desires that are not okay, but it doesn't mean that you're going to act upon them. And it certainly doesn't mean that it constitutes your identity, right? In the 18th, before the 19th century, you wouldn't have heard about the term homosexual ever because it was invented in Europe. And then, as opposed to nowadays, like all of the terminology is very catered towards sexuality and gender. In Islam, we don't have that. We only judge based on acts. In fiqh books, you will see definitions and terms that are used to delineate specific actions. But feelings or desires are not talked about because, feelings or desires are okay. They're only problematic when they become actions that are not okay in Islam, right? That's the gist of it. And so the problem with the identity paradigm, a lot of people say, well, what's the problem of me saying I am gay, lesbian, trans, even though I don't act upon it? Well, eventually it becomes a problem because it just lumps you in one category and it's going to dictate the social interactions that you have, the cultural groups that you belong to, the political affiliations that you associate yourself with. You're more progressive than conservative, quote unquote. And it's going to affect your religion because it's going to come clashing with religion and God at some point. And a lot of people end up leaving religion because they're like, he created me this way, he doesn't want me that way, then I don't want him either. And that's what happens, unfortunately. Spiritual perspectives, I'm going to go quickly into those. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of us have experienced God and religion wounds. We have seen God as someone who is judgmental, criticizing, harsh, who doesn't love us. We tried to connect with him, but he didn't reciprocate. I'm not good enough for him, right? Notice that this is a projection onto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on our earlier experiences. I prayed and I prayed, I fasted, I did everything that I could, nothing worked. It never disappeared. I'm still addicted to acting out. Nothing helps. I've tried to reach out to him. I've made tons of du'as. I cried to him. Nothing worked. Well, it's not going to work because there are all of these unmet emotional needs that are still there. Why would he test me with this? Is this even fair? It's very important for us as, educators and parents and teachers to realize the origins of these thoughts, the projections that they entail, to try and deconstruct all of that and tie it to any traumatic history, the family dynamics, as we've seen earlier on in this webinar. And to also see that, society does affect how we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a lot of the scholars and the imams talk about Allah as, vindictive and someone who's going to send you to hell no matter what you do, and, the shame discourse is always there, people are going to leave religion eventually, right? And it just adds fuel to the fire when you're already sensitive, you're already dealt with so much pain, and now Allah is going to burn you in hell because you are gay or you are lesbian. So I might as well just leave this religion altogether because what am I getting out of that, right? So this is what people say. One book that I want to recommend, I cannot get enough of this book, and I've been recommending it right and left. Secrets of Divine Love by A. Halwa. It was published last year. I would recommend it to all of your students. It really beautifully, I would say, heals these religion wounds and the God wounds and any misconceptions or projections that anyone may have had during his or her life. This book puts everything in proper perspective. It's based on love, and it's just beautifully written. So this is one thing that I recommend you check out if you haven't read it already, and you would recommend it to your friends, family, and even your students. I discussed the spiritual perspectives in episodes 14 to 25 when we talk about, putting everything in perspective, like the roles of trials and tribulations from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The story of Lut alayhi salam, where desires come from, the story of Adam and Eve and Satan and temptation and putting things in proper perspective. The idea of attachment to certain things, surrender, and all of these need to be discussed with people who struggle with these things, but also realizing that, okay, the spiritual perspective is important, but also there's a psychological element that needs to be deconstructed, because otherwise, praying and praying and making that is not going to help you when you have other issues that you need to deal with. So yeah. And the last thing, and I promise I'll be done in a minute, inshallah, the support systems and the relevant resources. I know that Brother Yahya shared a lot of articles that have been published online, and you guys have a database of a lot of audio visuals and writings online. So I'm not going to get into those because you already have them, but what I'm going to talk about in a little bit are support systems that I discussed in episodes 27 to 35. And these are support groups that are helpful to men and women who struggle with same-sex attractions and gender identity issues. One of them is called Straight Struggle, which is an online support group where people get together and they talk about anything they want. There's a supporting and loving environment for people to shed shame, to talk about therapy, to talk about self-help, to talk about books, to talk about their own experiences, and to have people listen to them and support them in the process. I've had the privilege of interviewing Brother Yusuf, who's the admin of this group, in episode 28, where he talks about the details of everything involved there. Another group is Strong Support, which is an organization in the UK that helps individuals struggle with same-sex lust, as Brother Ali, the founder, calls it. They host a lot of webinars, they provide online counseling and support, and Brother Ali was a guest in episode 29, so you might want to listen to that if you're interested in hearing more about Strong Support. As I said, a lot of individuals struggle with, sex addictions, pornography addiction, masturbation, lust. Sexaholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs have shown to be helpful to a lot of men and women who struggle with this. Episodes 30 and 31 are dedicated to that. Yeah, Brothers Road is a very important organization that I'd like to talk about. They have a lot of resources available. It's brothersroad.org. Lots of articles and resources available, but they also do, pre-COVID, they would usually host weekend getaways for, men. And there are counselors and therapists and individuals who would help them bond so that they would have their affective needs met in a very platonic and loving and supportive environment. And that's been very helpful to a lot of people I know. Episode 32 is dedicated to that, if you would like to give it a listen and find out more about them. And Joel 225, lastly, in episode 33, I interviewed two people from this organization. It started off as a Christian ministry organization, but then it spread and became international, and they support individuals from any denominational or non-denominational affiliation. They have a lot of resources, books, and support groups available to help anyone, anywhere. Take-home messages to everyone listening. I know it's been so much, and probably your brain is hurting right now. So if there are some take-home messages that I'd like you to get from this webinar are the following. To understand that childhood trauma and family dynamics play a huge role in same-sex attractions and gender identity issues. Shame is a common denominator, how it originates, how it propagates in family and society. And to identify the fact that peer relations and bullying play another role in disenfranchising people from their gender identity. And for educators, it's very important to create a safe space to offer counseling whenever available, and maybe therapy with proper individuals who know these issues would be important. And finally, the identity of I am gay versus I experience same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria is an important distinction. Having a spiritual connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very important. Identifying any wounds or any projections that we have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and cultivating a proper relationship with Him is very important. This struggle cannot be handled without a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And finally, there are support systems available, as I've said. This struggle should not be handled alone. People need others to heal and to grow and to recover. And for this, we need more awareness. We have to engage in these conversations. And there are lots of readings that can be offered, such as the books that I've mentioned and the articles that you have. And yeah, reaching out to support systems, reaching out to anyone who can help, and we're all available, inshallah. So, Jazakumullah khairan. This is all I have for today.
Okay, brother Waheed, Jazakallah khair. I think I can say on behalf of all of us here, this was a really beneficial presentation. I think one that, like you said, we'll probably need to watch again. So alhamdulillah, it's recorded. But this, I think, really helps me see, and many of us here, I'm sure, just the multi-layered dimensions, and therefore a multi-layer approach that's needed, especially those of us in education that are often on the front lines of dealing with students that may be experiencing this or struggling to understand this whole paradigm. So Jazakallah khair. There's a lot I could say myself in my own reflections, but I'd like to open it up to the group here for question and answer. We did have a shared document, and some people did put questions in before the session. But before we get those, I'd just like to open it up to the group that was here today. I know some people have to leave, so thank you for those that attended, and perhaps we'll be able to share the question and answer section. But I think first we can open it up to those that are attending today and may have a question related to the presentation, and we can go from there. And then if there's time to the questions that were written as well. So I'll open it up for questions. You can write in the chat or unmute yourself. You have access to unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, so let's go to the chat here. Let's see, Sister Saida has asked, is there a recommendation of what age group or grade can some of this info be shared with students at school so that the issue can be preemptively addressed? Okay, so that's our first question, Brother Waheed.
I don't know of any recommendation as to, how to present this information to particular age groups. I think it's up to educators to know the level of maturity, obviously. And there might be parental involvement, also counselors, etc. But I think that, for example, at earlier age groups, it's very important to address, the issue of abuse, let's say, or, sexual abuse, how to protect oneself, how to report it if it happens, that it's okay to talk about it with trusted individuals. As I said, shame is unfortunately a malady in our communities in particular, where, educators can play a role in destigmatizing whatever happens and try to engage in that conversation, even in private. So yeah, and maybe kind of cultivating a safe space for children to talk about, whatever they've been through, to feel that they are heard, that they are loved. If there is someone at school who's very clingy or he's very codependent or exhibiting questionable behavior, to kind of, address this with the parents and see where that is coming from, because that might lead to, uncovering certain family dynamics or traumas that can be dealt with. Maybe addressing sexual ethics before puberty or like at the time of puberty, pornography. I haven't seen anyone who has same-sex attractions or gender identity issues who doesn't have particular addictions to pornography or acting out or anything, because that is, again, part of the reparative drive that we have. So addressing these things and opening up the conversation and how to talk about them and how to navigate them and giving them support systems, I mean, we need that. So I think that maybe like age appropriately discussing these matters, you know better than me, I'm not an educator, but I think this can be kind of, yeah, made in a more comprehensive way that corresponds to particular age groups, if that makes sense. I don't know if I answered
Absolutely,
that.
yeah. And that's something we have discussed a little bit with our group, is looking at age-appropriate curriculum. Sister Saida, did you want to respond to that? I see
I just wanted to say Jazakallah khair. Thank you. It's just that a lot of times Islamic schools lack social counselors or, people that are with an expertise in this area. So yeah, we usually have to come up with our own ways of addressing it and dealing with it because we don't have social counselors on staff.
Right.
But
yeah, unfortunately, I mean, this is a problem. Yeah, and I can appreciate that this is something that is beyond you. But I believe that at least what we can do is at least engage in this conversation, because they are already being exposed to this on Netflix, on social media. You know, this conversation is being had in a different way. So we might as well just have it in our classrooms. Even if we don't have counselors, like, we can consult with each other. There are resources, there are books. Yeah, there are people who can speak about these things. So we can just try at least to, to engage in that conversation, offer a safe space for those children where they can express themselves at least, you know.
I have a question. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I know of a few cases, you know, in the community that when the person comes out, is usually like in the 20s, like at least the two cases that I know of in the 20s, late 20s, and they come out very, you know, strong, and they refuse the counseling and support. How could one provide support or convince them, or, you know, how could the parents go by that?
I've had in the past 2 years, actually, some parents approach me and they've had the same exact question. Like, our child is adamant, they're arrogant, they don't want to listen, we're trying to talk to them, they don't want to, and they're engaging in whatever they're engaging in, and they're adopting the LGBT lifestyle. The answer is always the same: you cannot force them to do anything. Those people have been suffering from the get-go. They've probably been dealing with shame and pain and hurt and loneliness for years and years and years. And they couldn't reconcile that with their religious understanding. They've never had that understanding probably at home, and they've just exploded. So it's not going to be possible to hold them back. But I really believe that at least giving them a loving environment, telling them, we're here for you, we love you, they're not going to mistake you for accepting their behavior. They know that you don't accept it, but at least knowing that they can refer to you when they need it, to give them an embracing and loving space where they feel loved and heard, is monumental, because they're going to be hurt. The LGBT community is very immature. Unfortunately, this is not talked about, but hurt creates hurt. Those are hurting people who are engaging in hurtful behavior, and their relationships are not going to last. They're very shallow, very superficial. And so those individuals who are coming out in their 20s and proud and living the lifestyle and thinking that it's all fine and dandy, they're going to be hurt, and it's traumatizing. It's just trauma fueling trauma. And at least what happens is, well, you know, at least I have those people that I can go back to who love me. And I know that they don't accept this behavior, but they accept me for me. They accept me as a human being, as a Muslim, as a brother, as a sister. And that is very important. On the short term, it might not make a big difference, but on the long term, it makes all of the difference. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Brother Waheed. So we're at about the 90-minute mark. There's a question here that Sister Kathy asked before she had to leave, and I think it would kind of summarize things today too, as a question that we've looked at a lot in our group, and it would be great to hear from you on this question. She asks, what advice can you give Islamic schools on how best to help students who struggle with SSA. And I suppose that ties into a bit with what you were saying with the emotional support and expressing that compassion, but perhaps you might expand on that a little bit too, specifically for Islamic schools.
Right, absolutely. So if you recall from the last slide, creating a safe space is very important. If there is an opportunity in offering, Islamic kind of counseling or therapy, if there are therapy options available, that would really be helpful. The readings, the books that I recommended, maybe the podcast, blogs, resources, articles available to encourage people to read them. The spiritual connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very important, to see the misconceptions and the projections that we have and to try to navigate that. Have a conversation about identity issues and deconstruct the identity issues and look at it from, an Islamic perspective and see why the Islamic paradigm is actually, much, much better than the essentialist paradigm. Also part of that conversation is encouraging people to reach out to those support groups, telling them that there are these support groups that are available. Please do reach out. Make friends, find someone you can connect with, and learn about these same-sex attractions, because a lot of those people don't even know where these attractions are coming from. I've always felt like that ever since I was a little kid. That's what they always say. So, but putting things in perspective and telling them, well, okay, let's try and navigate that and let's see where all of this is coming from. It is traumatizing at first because it's like you're ripping off an old Band-Aid and you're facing those wounds. But it's also liberating because it's like, okay, well, there's a way out. I can recover from a lot of the things that I've been facing. So I think that everything that I presented today in terms of support systems, resources, and engaging in that conversation is very important.
Absolutely, yeah. Jazakallah khair. Sister Rosina, if you would like to offer any commentary before we close out, please.
Yeah, Brother Waheed, Jazakallah khair for such a well done and really concise and comprehensive presentation. I'm sure a lot of us have some, responses and thoughts about what we've, what we've just seen and heard, particularly as it relates to like our experiences of SSA and gender identity and, in our particular spaces. So I just encourage everyone to like think about, just spend the next week thinking about your responses, and maybe next week we can kind of discuss, and make some sense out of how to take what we've kind of heard today in our experiences and make sense of it in some of the kind of, and to begin to answer some of the questions that have come up, because I think the answers are complex and it's not one answer, particularly in our different grades and different contexts and different subjects and different capacities that we have in these different spaces. So yeah, just hold your thoughts and continue to develop them until next week, inshallah.
Yes, Jazakallah khair. And that's just a nice reminder that we will continue probably for at least a couple more sessions with our working group. So if any of you are new today, you're welcome to join our V group. We'll meet again on next Saturday at 11:30 a.m. So again, Jazakallah khair, Brother Waheed. I just want to see if Sister Shaza has any final words or thoughts here before we close the session.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Brother Waheed, that was an absolutely amazing presentation. Yes, my mind is processing. I will absolutely need this whole week to really, and more. Thank you so much for all of the time and effort over all of the cumulative years that you've been pouring yourself into this, for what you've provided. And here at ISLA, we really seek to magnify your work and inshallah share this with more people. I look forward to being able to discuss this some more with our group, and I hope, Brother Waheed, we can keep our lines of communication open if there's things that continue to come up. I think that one of the topics that we've talked about in the past that we didn't get to explore here today is not just how do we talk with students experiencing SSA, or how do we support students experiencing SSA, but how do we talk to all of our Muslim youth in our Islamic schools who feel that Islam is a backwards religion because we don't accept these the actions, or SSE, I guess, same-sex engagement. That I think is just like really, really blowing up
this is a huge issue, and Muslim youth are leaving the deen, not because they have SSA, but because they don't agree with what is being perceived as backwards or non-inclusive. So I know that we've already, you've given so much of your time, and everybody here has to get on with their day, but those are some more things that inshallah we hope to discuss some more and continue to think about.
Yeah, Jazakumullah khair, and I'm very appreciative of this opportunity, and may Allah accept on our behalf. And if there's anything I can help with, please, I would love to keep the communication open and to help you further. And the last question that you talked about, I mean, the last thing, which is people leaving the religion because they see that Islam is very backward and it's not accepting, quote unquote. It's part of a larger conversation of, as I said, you know, deconstructing paradigms and seeing things for what they are, and kind of shedding all of that media baggage that we've been used to for all of these years, and looking at things the way that they really are as opposed to the way that they were presented to us. So it's part of a lot of, you know, research, and it's a larger question that needs to be answered in so many different ways, which will take time, inshallah, but I would love to help in whatever way I can. And Jazakumullah khair, and again, I'm very grateful for being here, and I hope that I have helped somehow. And if anyone has any questions, please do reach out to me anytime. I would love to help, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay, Jazakallah khair. And I know a few other questions came in, and I can send those on to you, Brother Waheed, too, and we can share with the community, inshallah.
No problem.
Okay, so fi amanallah wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.